let's hit it.
And welcome to Alzheimer Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori LeBay, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today. We are going to have a fascinating conversation as usual as we learn from people all around the world at all ages and stages of life. Stay tuned as we shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort.
All right, here we go. What you think about, you will bring about.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome back to Alzheimer Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori LeBay, and we are going to have a really interesting conversation today about grief and being a dementia caregiver. But before I introduce our guest, I always like to do a couple of shout-outs. So, one, I want to give a shout-out to the Mark Arneson Band for allowing us to use their music, Clarion Call, which, of course, you can download on any of your favorite music platforms. And for those of you that are new to our show, we are about sound information, not just sound bites. So we have an hour-long conversation with our guests. And when we're live, like we are today, we invite you to go ahead and call in and ask any questions that or make a comment that you might have. And that number is 323-870-4602. And I will pull you in when I see you pop up. I know many of you listen after the fact, because they are podcasts. But we want to just give you that opportunity because grief is a really important topic that we're going to be talking about today. And also, I want to invite you to think about, could you be our next guest? We have an audience that's worldwide, and we love to invite people at all different levels. So people that are diagnosed with a dementia, families that care and friends, advocates, researchers, a whole variety of businesses. And then, of course, we have our authors and our singers and our songwriters and our music directors. So, if you have something you'd like to, have heard and, maybe get input from others on, reach out to me at radio@alzheimerspeaks.com. Now, I always like to point people to our updated website, which is alzheimerspeaks.com. There you can access all of our free educational resources. So you just click on that page, and there's over a dozen different types of programs with multiple events and programs that you can review for free. Let's see. And then on December 8th, I just want to invite people who might be here in Minnesota. If you are in the Woodbury area, on December 8th, I will be doing an in-person program with Artist Senior Living, and that's all about family gatherings, events, and travel, and difficult times. How the heck do you keep the joy in the journey for all of you? We are going to hear from the footbar walker next, and then we'll be back with our guest.
I love the footbar walker, and let me tell you why. It is the option for my toolbox that I've been waiting for. Let's be honest. There are some clients who, despite our best rehab efforts, just aren't able to return to performing a sit-to-stand transfer on their own. Now I can offer my caregivers an easier, safer option that doesn't involve hoisting their loved one up from a sitting position. I don't recommend this walker for all of my clients, but I do recommend this walker for those caregivers looking for an easier, safer option with transfers. I would also encourage other therapists to add this walker to their toolbox. It's kind of like having my own mobile parallel bars for the client to pull up on. Whether it's a family caregiver at home helping a loved one with Parkinson's or dementia, CNAs in a long-term care facility assisting their patients, or therapists adapting to client and caregiver-specific needs, we now have a very safe and effective option to offer in the footbar walker. Check this product out at thefootbarwalker.com. That's it for today from Adaptive Equipment and Caregiving Corner. Have a great day, and don't forget, if you can't do it, adapt it.
Well, we are back, and it's time to have our conversation about understanding the grief of a dementia caregiver. And I am so honored to be talking with JT, who is the author of a book called 13 Months, Diary of a Caregiver's Grief. Jay has spent over 20 years in the field of mental health and addiction services as a licensed therapist, a supervisor, and instructor. And in her memoir, she really opens up and shares her struggles, the turmoil, the path to healing, and, how the heck can you support others on this journey? Because Lord knows, Jay's not the only one who has gone through this. So how do you walk out the other end whole? So welcome, Jay. I'm thrilled to have you on the show today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me a guest. I'm so honored to be here. And I do want to just take a moment to thank you so much for all you do. Your trailblazing support and interventions in dementia care just serves so many around the world.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of you to say. Now, Jay, I've got a list of questions here for you, but I always start out with my first one, asking my guest if they wouldn't mind sharing how, just briefly, how dementia touched you and your family and circle of friends as a whole here through the journey you went on.
Sure, I'm happy to share that. So I was a caregiver for my grandmother who had vascular dementia. And the process, like so many others have shared, was just filled with so much emotion and range of experiences, because she was such a dynamic and vivacious person and was such an important bright spot in my life. Many people were often really surprised because she was very petite in stature, but she just had this force of a personality and really strong, welcoming, and loving nature. In my journey after my grandfather died, she really started doing a lot of things in her early 70s, such as traveling around the world. So she always had a real gusto for life. And like how you've shared about your mother, Lori, she was just very fiercely independent. But as she aged and issues started to develop, which is the case for so many families, and in particular, she was first diagnosed with macular degeneration. And what our family didn't realize at the time is this would then become the filter or the lens for other medical issues. And the reason why I mention that is, and I think others can relate to this, when I look back now, I see early signs of dementia, but these were all kind of explained through her vision issues. So we didn't know kind of really what was happening. And then during kind of those initial years, my caregiving was really more in a form of social support to kind of help with errands. I would come every other weekend. But then there was this one particular event that kind of shook everything, where I came in on a Friday, and I could tell she was very distressed, and she said, there's this carnival outside and they're blocking your car. And I really was stunned. I didn't know what to say. And I just tried to soothe her and try to kind of normalize things. And when I was able to in private, I reached out to her sister Millie, which in tandem we did a lot of the caregiving for her. And then she was taken to the doctor, and we were told that she had Charles Bonnet syndrome, which produces, for those with macular degeneration, can produce visual hallucinations. But really, I guess it was just like this constant kind of confusion of what's really going on. And then not too long after that, there was the event that really kind of changed everything, and finally we received the diagnosis of dementia, where she had a mini stroke, or a TIA, and she was hospitalized. And that really was the first time when dementia issues were mentioned. I worked really closely with Millie to try to create like a caregiving plan, because, as I said, she was fiercely independent, and she had always shared with us, like, you're going to have to drag me out of this house. I'm going to keep living here. And so it was really a struggle to try to make sure she was cared for, but yet still honor her independence. But things really kind of went downhill quickly, because her sister Millie was, kind of aging herself. And so I kind of made the overture to say, well, you know what if I move her to where I live? And she seemed really open to that. And what we were able to do is find a dementia-assisted living facility, and then she stayed with me and my husband Alejandro every weekend, so that it hopefully gave her that stability. And with my dementia care journey, during this time I really tried to keep her connected to all that she loved, because she was really, understandably heartbroken and disoriented at all these changes. And one of the things that it always makes me think of how I love the slogan that the Adaptive Equipment and Caregiving Corner resource you have at the start of your show, where it says, if you can't do it, adapt it. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I did that with so many, and I think other caregivers do, to emotionally adapt something. So like she had always been a vivacious traveler and loved music, so I was like, I'll just try to bring all that to her. Mm-hmm. And that worked for a while. Like in particular, she had always loved traveling, so I'd buy those like really large coffee table books of different countries, and we talk about her travels. And then as much as possible, I always tried to kind of create these like what I called quote unquote vacations, so that she felt like she was getting away. And during that time, I was so immensely grateful to my friend Tara, who I mentioned in the memoir, because the vacations, quote unquote, really amounted us to driving to Tara's house in the country, which is really only 30 minutes away, but for my grandmother, it always seems much longer. So she had this idea we were venturing to some exotic location. And so that helped for a time. But there was, again, continued decline and falls and ongoing distress. And then also the toll for me is, as much as I wanted to handle everything well, it became very overwhelmed quickly with everything I needed to oversee. And along with the pull of emotions that comes, I think, with everyone can understand with dementia caregiving. So I descended into kind of what I kind of felt or referred to as like a hole of dementia caregiver quicksand. But I kept doing the best I can, and I was with her until the end.
Wonderful. Do you mind telling our audience, because I think that people are interested in this, if you're comfortable, sharing kind of your age and where you're at? You mentioned you're married. Do you have children? All of those, some of just that kind of background, because I think people forget all people of all ages are getting care out there.
Yes,
sometimes we just assume everybody is like us. And so if you're comfortable with that, I think that would be wonderful.
Sure. No, I'm actually 53 now. Mm-hmm. My grandmother, I started caregiving, in my mid-30s or so, as I think back. And I had caregived for her in different capacities for over 15 years. And so I'm married, and I do not have children. That was one of the reasons why I felt I could step in. While I did work full time and, of course, had my own life responsibilities, I felt like, I think I can do it. And I wanted to do it because, like I said, she had been such a huge importance in my life, and I wanted to give back so much of the love that she had given to me growing up.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks for sharing that, because I think sometimes, especially when we're dealing with grief, when in any time you're caring for somebody, it's kind of like being a juggler. And, what your life expectations were to what they are now, all of that kind of comes into play, I think, with that. So, but first, let's talk about what additional issues are there that people need to consider when, they're going through this dementia caregiver grief. I just think it's such a big bubble that people aren't really comfortable talking about, because we live in a society where I think we're afraid of how everyone's judging us, and we're supposed to be in control of every little minute detail in our life, and if we're caring for somebody else, them too. So what are some of those other areas that you think and issues that can pop up that people might not think of?
Yes, well, and I agree completely with what you shared. I think both with, dementia caregiving and grief, there still carries a lot of stigma. There's not a lot of discussion. And I think just grief for anyone in general with any type of situation brings up so many emotions and is incredibly challenging. Just, again, that's with any loss. And I think for me, what was difficult and what I share in the memoir is that I had experiences of losses. Certainly, I didn't think that was going to make this loss something that I could easily go through, but I felt like I had some initial preparation. So I was really just extremely shocked and confused when my grief after being a caregiver felt so different. And it really was like a tsunami of emotions that came in very quickly. And for dementia caregiver grief, what I came to understand is that these additional factors are important to be mindful of. And it's actually also one of the many reasons I'm so grateful to the dementia community with their openness to share, because when I was struggling to understand, gosh, why is my grief so intense?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find anything in kind of regular grief resources. So I turned to the dementia community for answers, and that's where I was really able to learn from others and piece together that, in hindsight, it's always 20/20. You think like, oh my gosh, why didn't I just see that to begin with? But it really took hearing the stories of other dementia caregivers to notice I wasn't just navigating one loss. These were multiple losses throughout the caregiving process. And kind of having this knowledge was a big step in what helped me heal, because I thought, I realized that our grief contains a series of, expected and unexpected kind of continual losses. Many people have talked about, there's a sense of loss with the diagnosis, and I definitely felt that. There's the loss of family relationships because of the stress that comes from caregiving. If our loved one has personality changes, that's another loss. I know for me, witnessing how hard it was on my grandmother to see her capabilities change, I took that on. And then on top of that, I recognized there was the high impact loss at the end where I had the combination of the death of my grandmother along with the loss of my identity as a caregiver. And I really, that surprised me because I didn't know what to do with myself, and I didn't know who I was anymore.
Yep. Oh, and I can so relate to that because I think so many people, go up to someone who's in that kind of grief stage and who has lost someone, and they'll say, well, what do you like to do? And I remember my answer to that question clear as day. I don't know. I didn't focus on me for so many years. I don't have a clue what I like at this stage of my life. I mean, I had totally lost my identity of myself in the journey, and I had to kind of refigure out who do I want to be when I grow up all over again. And I think that that's so common. The other thing is I think so many people don't understand, like you had mentioned, the amount of emotion and like where is all of this coming from? Because you think you're dealing with it and you're preparing yourself, but you can never, ever really prepare yourself, for the very end. And so here in Minnesota in our dementia-friendly group, we pulled together a program called the Dementia Caregiver Reentry Program, because so many people feel so lost. And so Warren Wolf is working on a workbook, for that. We kind of took it after a memory cafe style, because they said we don't want an 8-week grief group because we're going to still be grieving and then we're going to be alone. They wanted something that would go on and where people could discuss, like, how do I clean out the closets? How did you adjust to driving or now paying the bills? How do you cook for one? How do you get to sleep at night? I can keep myself busy and my mind busy during the day, but I go to bed and then I'm just overwhelmed, And so they're able to share with people who are going through that process, and they really support each other, so well. So I think it's a very underserved and misunderstood group because, and this is my belief, but I don't think there's a step, A to Z that you follow with this. It's kind of like you mentioned, grief is different for everybody, and everyone's circumstances are different, and they might be dealing with family dynamics or financial crisis or health issues of their own or addictions. All that stuff comes into play. that has to be considered with that. Let's talk next a little bit about, complementary holistic approaches to healing. I really believe in researching and getting knowledge on all different things. And I didn't really get spiritually and holistically connected until I was really in my late 30s or 40s. And it was like, oh my gosh, why was this not taught to me in school? These things are really, really helpful, and so talk about that, what your feelings are on that, because I know you've got some strong feelings there.
Yes, well, I mean, again, this is another area where I'm so grateful to you for all you do, because you really honor holistic, complementary, and alternative approaches. And I love how you really, include them and identify how they can be part of, again, that beautiful phrase you have of shifting the conversation from crisis to comfort. Because for me, these approaches and techniques were the absolute key for my healing. I just would not have been able to have as much healing without them, because I think one of the things that, as you shared, there's so much stigma about grief and caregiving and not enough discussion. And, we now know a little bit more about, well, I should say a lot more about kind of how grief in particular impacts the body, mind, and spirit. And for me, I felt like just grief came and hijacked my brain. I was just like, I don't know who I am anymore. And I really needed something within my healing process that, had that body, mind, spirit component. So I feel very similar to you that these approaches, if again, everybody's different, just like you said, if these speak to you, if these speak to someone, they can be really valuable in the grief healing process. And again, holistic, which, embraces a body, mind, spirit philosophy, for me was wonderful because it ensured kind of that for me as the whole person is being cared for. And with complementary and alternative approaches, which, are considered non-traditional approaches, those can be integrated into healing. But things that I used that were so instrumental in the healing process, things like aromatherapy, acupuncture, movement therapy, and I know you've had past speakers or past guests who talked on art and music therapy, is so important. And then to things like energy practices such as Reiki and sound healing, that's the area I'm passionate about and specialized in. But these are really instrumental in kind of opening kind of a full layer of healing of well-being for everyone. So I've found that those have worked incredibly well because they really offer kind of a different framework, I think.
Oh, definitely. Well, I just don't think, if people haven't been through grief, they don't understand the trauma that someone goes through. And there's the trauma of a loss of a loved one, but there's a whole nother level when it's a loved one that you have specifically cared for and, we're in tune with kind of 24/7. Or even if they're in a community and you're not living together, you just get connected at this different level. And one of the things for me, and I was thankful that I was able to tap into some of these holistic and spiritual healing helpers for me was, I could communicate with my mom on a whole different level. And so as my mom progressed in her disease, I was so in tune with every body movement. If it was a twink in the eye, or a smile or a giggle or just movements that I would probably overlook being too busy being busy. I saw those things and I knew exactly what her needs were. And even, when she was in her end stages, when she couldn't talk, we were so connected. She would come to me in dreams and make things really clear. And even after she passed, she would come to me in dreams. And I know some people might think that that's crazy, and you can push that stuff away, or you can choose to embrace it and find great comfort in it. And I found a huge level of comfort and it also allowed me to learn that there are many, many steps of unconditional love that I didn't know existed.
Yes.
Because of the level of the connection. And, I thought unconditional love kind of came when you had a child, or you had a spouse, and you kind of took those two for granted, but I never really thought bigger of that or deeper of that. And boy, that really opened up my eyes in many, many ways. Can you talk a little bit about, breaking some of these down from, aromatherapy and movement, and, some people might not even know what Reiki and sound healing is, meditation, those types of things. How do you find a practice, and what does it entail?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to share kind of, again, my process, my experience was very similar to you in terms of, I was like, I know I need something more than what traditional medicine is offering. Not that traditional medicine it has so many valid uses and importance, but I just felt like there just was something more. And that's why, similar to you, I was really grateful to the healers and teachers that helped me on my path. And I think regardless of kind of what technique you're using, I think there's a similar foundation with all of them that really honors our own inner wisdom and intuition. And the framework is that these, embrace a body, mind, and spirit from the perspective that, like, I know with traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture, they view that, the organs of our system have, their normal function, but they also have a spiritual function. So, for example, grief is related to the lung, whereas anger is related to the liver, and fear is related to the kidneys. And so all of that is treated, the body, mind, and spirit are all treated as one. And I think also, like with Reiki and sound healing, which again are considered energy practices, they also believe that in addition to our physical body, that we also have an energy system. And that's similar also in traditional Chinese medicine. So the perspective is that stress and dis-ease actually start in the energy fields and work the way into our body and mind. So Reiki and sound healing are used to kind of release and transform the energy areas, because they need just as much healing as well. And I think that when you speak of kind of being connected to your mom, I felt the same way. And so I was, after her passing, I felt like I was carrying not just like my own energy and the heavy energy from caregiving, but also, again, her emotions. I definitely still felt very much connected to her. And so these were the approaches that really kind of helped kind of clear things out and offer kind of some transformation and healing. I think another piece that relates to kind of all the approaches is there's a belief that everything has value, and in particular, all emotions are important to express. In my memoir, and at that time, there was a lot of emphasis placed on always being positive, to such an extreme that, like, don't be angry, don't have these feelings, be happy. And I was like, I hear that, and I wish I could do that, but I just have this huge tsunami of emotions coming out. I'm not sure what to do with them. And so for me, it was really a relief to hear, like, nothing within, holistic perspective. There's no good, bad, positive, negative emotions. Everything has a purpose. Everything is valuable in the healing process. And so through, in particular, I learned about kind of honoring emotions from clinician Rob Priest, who does a lot of work with Buddhist traditions as well as Jungian analysis. And he was really instrumental in letting me just kind of open up, recognize what's there, let things be. And then I was able to kind of connect with those emotions instead of trying to push them away, and be like, what does this part of me or what does this emotion need to heal? And that just, that again allowed healing to take place rather than kind of resistance or repression of what I was feeling.
Well, it's, I just find it all so fascinating. I'll tell you a story. This was kind of funny because I was naive. I didn't really know a whole heck of a lot of anything alternative. I grew up in a household. My mom, they'd bring us to the doctor if we were sick, and we would talk as a family if we had an issue. And I was at a conference, and I really wanted to. I felt like my intuition was kind of perking, and I remembered a few instances in my life where my mom's intuition was right on. And it was, she didn't want to drive one day, and she had to go pick up my dad for whatever reason, and she got rear-ended and got whiplash, and suffered for years with that. And the times where another time my brother was supposed to go on a ski trip, and she said, "You're not going," and he was so mad because all his friends were going. They all died of carbon monoxide poisoning. And so
oh my goodness,
it was, a couple of big major things I remember growing up, but we didn't really talk about it at all. And then I found myself getting very kind of in tune and like, how did I know this before it happened, and things. And so I was at this conference, and I was just waiting for, I think, to get my hotel room or something. And there was a line, and I started talking with this woman in California, and we just both opened up right away. And she was a sound healer. I had never ever heard of that. And here in the lobby, she's like, I can feel you're carrying a lot of stuff. She's like, do you mind if I do some sound work on you? And I'm like, well, what does that entail? And she says, I'm just going to blow sound into your back. And so here we are in the lobby. And like I said, I thought, well, what the heck, it was amazing how I felt. I the vibration of her voice into my back, and I was fully clothed. It wasn't like I had an open back dress or anything like that, but it was incredible. And it was just like, wow, that is really, really something. And there was another conference that had a bunch of healers there, and and that's why she was there and why I met her. And I still talk to her to this day. And this was, oh my gosh, 20 years ago. But it really opened up the door for me to explore more and not be so afraid. Because I know a lot of people think when they hear healing or holistic, they think anti-God, and it's going to go against their religion. And I did personally training with Echo Bodine here in Minnesota. And I mean, she's a big believer in God. And she's like, all of this is part of God. It's really his wisdom coming through. But for us not to be afraid of it. And like you said, the aromatherapy, there's great research out on that. And the movement and the music and the arts, they're really starting more and more research on that, on how it can change our energy and stuff. Meditation. Now, are you a Reiki practitioner, or did you go to Reiki sessions?
Both. I had such a good experience similar to what you shared with the sound healing with Reiki, that, and what I love about it, again, it works exactly where each person is at, and it's very kind of tailored to what you're needing. It's not like a manualized approach, like everybody's going to get this. It really, again, attunes to each person's energy and what they need. And I just had such, like I said, there was just this huge release of not just kind of my own heavy energy that I was carrying, but, residual things from family, that I just became really passionate about, kind of moving into holistic care as opposed to traditional therapy. And just as kind of an aside, because I had a really similar, when you were sharing your stories, and again, the myth of that it might be anti-God or anti-spiritual, and I really agree with you. It embraces people where they are at with their own traditions and can really be adapted based on your own belief system. I had been working or studying with a traditional healer in Mexico, and one of the questions that I asked him was, I know you come from this tradition and this philosophy. What do you do when you work with someone from a different faith? And his response was really, for me, it made so much sense. He just said, well, I tell my God to speak to their God about what I'm seeing. so that there wasn't, again, that everything again can work together.
Exactly. There's a book that Us Against Alzheimer's put out. I'll have to look up the name of it while we're talking. But they have different like religious groups and things like that that support dementia, and they talk about all different types of spirituality and things. And what was really interesting with this one book is I think it had like 17 or 18 different religions in it. And one of the things that I remember it was a priest or a pastor saying is it was really helpful to see how other religions practice and how much overlap there actually is between us. And he adapted other religions' practices in to help his service of not only himself, but, of his congregation. And he said, and they loved it. He said, it's just kind of a different type of prayer, a different way to do the same thing with it, maybe a little bit different label, a little bit different twist. But, and I thought, well, that was a cool way to put that. I thought that was really, really, really helpful in terms of how to frame things. If a pastor, priest, or I want to say rabbi, and that's not it. Rabbi, sorry, there. A rabbi can differentiate the differences, but yet appreciate the similarities in the end goal. The rest of us should understand that as well with that. So that's really, 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 really neat. Gosh, as far as trauma goes, did you have anything in your head of how you were going to feel before your loss? Did you have, I think sometimes we have preconceived ideas of what it's going to look like, what grief is going to look like, and how we're going to handle it?
Yes, and I'm kind of actually chuckling inside when you say that, because it's not that I thought, I have this down, everything's going to be like a cakewalk, but I had my list, I had my, support process, I had, the therapist from hospice, which again is what is the basis of the memoir. So I thought, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do the very best I can, and that plan just shattered pretty much immediately. And my grief process for me was so challenging, and I felt a lot of shame about it for so long, because I was just like, why can't I just get it together? I mean, I have all these resources. Why is it so immense? I had such a long time with her. Is it because I'm not grateful enough? All of these thoughts swirled around, and that's where I completely agree with you. And a big piece also of the healing that took place was that I needed at some point to start considering trauma within the context of dementia caregiver grief. I didn't include that from the beginning because, again, I just hadn't been aware of it. But now when I look back and I write about it in the memoir, I really see that there's, in particular, two key ways where trauma relates to dementia caregiver grief. And for me, a big opening that happened where I started to understand why the grief process was so difficult and not matching up with what I had planned for is that I was experiencing what's now often called post-caregiver PTSD. And like I said, I saw everything through the lens of, grief. So I had not even been really considering trauma. But I stumbled upon an article that was called "For Some Caregivers, the Trauma Lingers." And it just was like this big aha moment, because then I was like, oh, this makes so much sense why this is such a challenge, and this feels so much more than just grief. And then I was really able to recognize, and again, I felt, I'll be really honest, because, I'm a trained therapist. I was like, well, this just confirms like I'm an idiot or something, because why couldn't I see this? But when you're in the throes of grief, and again, your brain gets hijacked, you're not functioning like your normal self. So I needed outside resources to help. But then I was able, again, to really, once I had this aha moment, I was able to look at kind of the main cluster of PTSD symptoms and be like, oh, okay, I get it. Like in particular for me, and I share this a lot in the memoir, I had so many intrusive thoughts, and in particular, I just had ongoing nightmares where my grandmother was distressed. I couldn't reach her. Just pretty much sleeping was not a pleasant experience. And my mind also obsessed over past decisions, certain, like, I didn't do enough, and why didn't I see this sooner? I know that that's a familiar theme with dementia caregivers.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of, which surprised me, I had a negative change in my thinking and mood. In particular, and this is why I think I didn't see it as trauma right away, it really seemed particular to my role as a caregiver. I just had these persistent, really negative beliefs about myself, a lot of guilt and shame, and all I kind of remembered were my mistakes as her caregiver. I felt like I didn't do enough. I felt like everything I did was wrong. And then I think the one area that probably surprised me the most is that I had what's considered kind of in the cluster of symptoms a significant change in my physical and emotional reactions. I really had like a heightened startle response. I was easily startled. I would really be on guard for like something bad's going to happen, like just this feeling of walking on eggshells. And then my mood, my emotions, I became really irritable and angry over like nothing. And it was really shocking to me because I would get really angry, like for example, at my friend Tara for nothing, or be in a grocery store and just be really frustrated. And that just made me feel like I was like, I am a stranger to myself. Who is this person? I just, and so that just, again, compounded feeling bad. But when I started looking through the context of trauma symptoms, irritability and anger are very, very common. And it was with that knowledge then I could, again, start finding ways to heal that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is, true that post-traumatic stress, because you're so involved and people don't understand how deep the connections are and how routine your patterns have gotten and your thought process of what you prioritize in life, all changes just in a snap of a finger. And, when you were talking about those kind of that looping of I didn't do enough or I should have done this different or whatever, that second guessing, I think, oh my gosh, I hear people say that all the time. And then when you mentioned, the physical and the emotional response changes as well, people are struggling with their moods. They don't feel like they have as much control. Maybe they were one that wasn't depressed, and I think some of it is, you're so busy being busy, you don't take the time to feel during the journey a lot of times. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it's like the clock stops, and you don't have all these things to do, and now you have this dead space that's wide open in your head, and your head just goes, your inner critic just kind of takes over. And, and that's one thing I've learned through this process, too, is to say to my inner critic, okay, you had your say, you said it once, I heard you, get the heck out of my head now. That's enough. That's enough. I'll give you your space, but you're not taking over the whole real estate here, and kind of taking back control. But those things are just, they're so profound, and yet they're so subtle. I remember when I started caring for my mom had dementia for 30 years. My dad had brain cancer for 4.5. And all of a sudden I had some health issues, nothing major, luckily. All of a sudden I developed asthma. It's like, where the heck did that come from? All of a sudden I had a little more anxiety because I was just wired so tight. And then I got acid reflux from the stress of being wired so tight. And those things all kind of melted away after my journey, not necessarily right away. With my mom, it was really after my dad, things had kind of melted away. And with my mom, I think my body, heart, and mind was more in sync with a better balance. And but that was just weird, and I actually had to like fight with the doctors. I'm like, get that stuff off my chart. You know, and they ask you every year, and I'm like, no, I have not taken that for years. Would you remove that? I just, come on, you know,
right?
And things, but you know, it's subtle stuff. Your blood pressure, just your eating habits, your energy levels, everything is so intertwined. And I don't know about you, but this happened to me, and I've heard it happen to a lot of people. Is when you are doing a good job caring for someone else, a lot of other people start coming to you at different levels to assist them, and you kind of become the fixer. And I think that that's something that many of us take on that we don't even know we're taking on, but it just becomes part of who we are. And then all of a sudden you're really getting overloaded, because it's like you're putting more energy into other people's lives than they're putting into yours, because that's a different type of, and it really isn't a caregiver. It's being codependent, which I didn't even realize at that point, you know, until I had one of those dreams, you know, that came to me and said, no, this isn't caregiving. This is codependency, and you need to stop it, or it's going to kill you. You know, taking care of my mom and dad was definitely being a caregiver or a care partner, whatever, you know, verbiage you want to do. But again, that's something that should be taught in school, why we do what we do. You know, are we doing it because we want to do it, or are we doing it because we're afraid we're going to get judged, or, you know, there's going to be other things, you know, that are going to kind of come back at us if we don't. And there's a big difference of wanting to do something and doing it because you feel like you have to, or in that you don't have any control. And I don't think most of us think of those things at all. We just, you know, no can be a tough word to use, but boy, once you learn it, you'll love it. You know.
Very true. Very true.
Oh gosh, this is just such a great, I think, to me, uplifting conversation too, in terms of giving people some options and things. What do you think about support groups and some of the different layers that a dementia caregiver can use, along with holistic, along with you know, Western medicine and things too? Do you have like a tier of things, or do you have a toolbox? Do you look at it as all a toolbox and everyone's an individual and needs to kind of assess those things individually?
Well, I definitely agree that we all have individual needs, and so everybody definitely needs to build their own individual toolbox. And I'm a big supporter in, you know, whatever works for anyone, how many tools somebody needs, definitely, you know, build what works for you. I know for me, part of my healing was that, you know, I like I said at the beginning, I was like, oh, I'm gonna do the best I can. I'm gonna make these list of supports, and I'm gonna do the, you know, basically again, kind of try my best to kind of build that support with grief, which again, and the tools themselves were really helpful. But what I realized that I needed kind of more of, that I didn't recognize for quite some time, is that when I was just kind of making this one-layered toolbox, I was really viewing grief support, all of the things that I was putting in my toolbox were things that I was reaching outside myself for. I was looking externally for validation and answers. So I'd go to my grief therapist, I read this book, I do this support group, which again are all really important. But what I came to realize that for me, in addition to just a toolbox, is that I needed kind of layers of support. I needed to remember that there were going to be times when I shouldn't, or I guess I shouldn't say shouldn't, it wasn't the best match to reach outside externally. I needed to turn inward. And that actually led me for myself, and I'm going to share this just in case it might be helpful for someone else, but I really came to kind of almost view it like it was a quilt approach to dementia caregiver grief support. And what I mean by kind of a quilt approach, and this really comes, it really stems from my grandmother speaking to me, because she was an avid quilter. She was very gifted at sewing and crafting in general, and that was one of the things she handed down to me that I still continue to sew. But I do have to say she was very meticulous. And while I definitely took on her love of crafting and sewing, I did not inherit the meticulous trait. I always refer to myself as a rogue sewer. I'm not super neat and polished. But what I learned from her through her quilts that were so strong and really provided comfort is she taught me how quilts are made with, this combination of 3 layers. And so each layer is important on its own, but when you combine the 3, it results in kind of this strength. And so for me, what I kind of came to view that was helpful for me personally was kind of creating this layers of support for grief. And for myself, I termed them as the inner support layer, external support, and a universal or divine layer. And I can share a little bit more kind of what I mean with that. So the inner support is what I was kind of missing from the beginning. I really needed to remind myself that I was my own inner compass, that I had my own inner healing capacity, that I didn't always need to be reaching out to someone or getting validation from somewhere else, that there were going to be times when I just needed to sit with myself, not really grasp at anything, not analyze anything, but just kind of tell myself I was okay. And then there is still, of course, the external, which, going to therapy, going to acupuncture, all of those are really, really healing. But I found that when I started with that inner layer first, then those external supports were more effective because I was layering on top of my own inner wisdom. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I came to kind of recognize that there are going to be times when I really needed to concentrate on kind of what we touched on before, that universal, divine, or spiritual layer. And I think this is a layer of support that allows us in any kind of belief system. It's adaptable. It's to open up and take in support and healing from something that's larger than ourselves. So for some people, this might be a spiritual faith. It might be for others the connection to their community or a need to be surrounded in nature. Kind of anything that opens us up and connects us to, kind of a larger, purpose. Mm-hmm. And so for me, not just thinking only of a toolbox, but these layers and kind of checking in with myself and being like, what layer do I need? It's not just the tool, but do I need more of the inner support? Do I need external? Do I need universal? Really kind of helped to make sure that I was meeting kind of the need that I needed in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like that I've always kind of looked at it, like I said, as a toolbox, but I like the layering of that. I think that makes a lot of sense, because I know for myself, when you line those 3 layers together, wow, are they powerful? Because, mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that sometimes is missing is our inner belief that, we can kind of re-steer the ship and get back on track and get balanced. And there's a level of denial, sometimes very unconscious. But when you are in tune to that, you can adjust. But when you're not, mm-hmm. when you don't even know that unconsciously that is happening, then it's harder to right the ship, mm-hmm. and our thoughts. Our thoughts are important, big time in terms of what happens. I'll give an example of this, and my listeners have heard this before, but I think some of these things you can never hear too much of. But I used to get really frustrated, and I would get in a screaming match with God, and I would go down in my basement when no one was home. I made sure all the windows were shut, and I would just yell, drop me a bone. This is too stressful. I'm in mm-hmm. overload. And always within anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 days max, the answer would become really clear to me. And And again, granted, everybody, I shouldn't be yelling at God, but I had to get that emotion out of my body, and I think He mm-hmm. understood that, and He's mm-hmm. still willing to help me. But I would get these insights, or intuitive pings or messages from God, whatever you want to call them. It doesn't make any difference. But I would realize that as hard as I was focusing to fix a problem, I really wasn't focused on fixing the problem. I was overwhelmed by all the minutia surrounding the problem.
Yeah.
And when I asked him, to drop me a bone and tell me what's the lesson. I believe you're not putting me through this if there's not a lesson attached. And then I was asking the right question. What's the lesson? And then it became clear, and then I could go in and rebalance things out, whatever it was. And it was just a simple little thing, but that along with support groups and the belief that I could have these conversations, that I could get an answer, all of those layers I think were really, really important for me, anyways, to be healed. I cannot believe our time has flown by. We only have like 4 minutes left of our conversation here. I told you it would go fast, but it even went really, really fast for me, which doesn't happen all the time. Is there one last thing you would like to let our audience know, and then we'll make sure that we give them your contact information and we'll close up?
Well, I mean, again, I just so have appreciated that you made space for the conversation on grief, and in particular dementia caregiver grief, because like you mentioned so eloquently, it can be a really hard topic to talk about. And I know, I've discussed, I kind of really shared, the inner workings. My memoir is a very open and candid account of how challenging my grief process was, but I share that in the context of trying to offer hope. So I guess the one thing that I would share is that, for anyone struggling with grief after being a dementia caregiver, know that you're not alone, and that what might feel like a struggle and feel like pain is actually the path that is going to open up and give you the keys to hope, self-acceptance, and healing. So you are really okay exactly as you are with whatever you're feeling, and hope and healing will come from that path.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been just fantastic. I want to make sure that people have your website. It's JAYETT, so JT.com, or you can email her at authorjt@gmail.com. And her handle on Twitter is authorjt. Same on Facebook, authorjt. And Facebook was being stubborn with me, so you might want to just try JT too. Sometimes Facebook's been just wonky lately, in my opinion. But try both of those. But again, we have those links on the show page, on the blog, everywhere we push out. You've got access to those. I highly recommend her book. Again, it's called 13 Months, The Diary of a Caregiver's Grief. These are conversations we have to have, and they don't have to be all doom and gloom. Hopefully you have picked up a few nuggets here, and if nothing else, you feel like you're not alone on this journey, and the emotions you're feeling, someone else has had them too, and they are normal. There is not one path to grief. We're all different. So again, thank you all so much. Again, if you think you might want to be a guest on the show, reach out to me at radio@alzheimerspeaks.com. And again, Jay, thank you so much for sharing your brilliance and sharing your life with us. I really appreciate it. It's going to help a lot of people.
It's really been an honor. So thank you so much, Lori.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jared Sebestier, host of Retire Repurposed. This podcast is dedicated to help people transition into fulfilling and purposeful retirements. Retirement is a big life change. In fact, the two most dangerous years of a person's life are the year they were born and the year they retire. Few people can just flip the switch from working a career 30 or 40 plus years, retiring on Friday, without methodical steps to living what we call a repurposed retirement. To listen now, search Retire Repurposed on your favorite podcast platform, Senior Resource, or Life Audio.